When the First World War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, it actually didn't lead to peace, but rather dragged the world into another series of crises that lead into the Second World War. So we're going to look at what those crises were and how they contributed to conflict into 1938 when the Second World War started. So, of course, the government that kind of got hit the hardest with the end of World War One was Germany. The empire collapsed, the Kaiser resigned, and you had a new government called the Weimar Republic. And while this was supposed to be, a democratic republic style government, almost immediately it had a series of failures. For one, Germany really didn't have much of a democratic tradition, right? England had parliament, France had the Estates General, and then the Revolution. Germany had always been either the Holy Roman Empire or a set of principalities and kingdoms or the German Empire. So people weren't really involved or trusting the German government because it wasn't made up of nobility. It wasn't the kind of government they had in the past. The political parties that were involved were pretty varied, and there were really too many of them to effectively make any kind of governing coalition. They're constantly fighting with each other and not be able to get much done. And maybe most disastrously, this is the government that signed the Treaty of Versailles. In 1918, a lot of German soldiers thought the war was almost over because they were going to win. They were within 100 miles of Paris. They thought they could win the war. And then all of a sudden, they get news in November that Germany was surrendering, and then this treaty put all the blame on Germany. And a lot of people felt sort of betrayed by this new government. Economically, you see another series of crises, partly due to the Treaty of Versailles and partly due to the inefficiency of the Weimar Republic. Germany went through a period of what we call hyperinflation. Inflation is where money loses its value. Hyperinflation is where money loses value very, very quickly. The problem that Germany had was they had to pay back this Treaty of Versailles debts, and as part of the treaty, they had to pay it in gold. Basically, they had to pay it in either funds or other resources that weren't just sort of paper money. So within Germany, they used just paper money called the Papiermark. And the German answer to them sort of running short on cash was just, well, let's print some more. And of course, you think about supply and demand and scarcity. This meant that the money became worth less very, very quickly. At the peak of Weimar Republic's hyperinflation, they were printing 400 quadrillion marks a day. I won't count the number of zeros for you, but you can see that's a lot. And that meant that these marks just kept losing value very, very quickly. This really collapsed in 1923 in what's called the Ruhr Crisis. France and Belgium, who were owed money from the Treaty of Versailles, said, okay, you need to pay us these debt payments. And the German government said they couldn't. France and Belgium invaded the Ruhr Valley, which was Germany's most productive industrial region. And so now not only are they having this economic crisis, they're being occupied by a foreign power. And this led to an even worse inflation crisis. You can see on the chart how quickly inflation rose. One thing to keep in mind is this chart is not linear, it's logarithmic. So the inflation was growing very, very quickly. You can see in the photo here, this loaf of bread was 460 million marks. It's just really out of control inflation. People, sometimes it sort of gets tossed around almost as a joke how worthless the money was. I mean, these are real things that happened. The money was literally worth less than the paper was printed on. You can see what people did with them, wallpapering. It was cheaper to burn marks than to buy firewood. And it sounds kind of like a joke, but imagine living in this. You get a paycheck, and then within a couple days, it's not worth anything. You can't buy anything with it. So this caused a huge problem in German society, and especially the German government. One thing to keep in mind, interestingly, is that this is not the worst hyperinflation in history. I think it's only like the fifth worst. One of the worst was actually in the past couple decades in Zimbabwe. In 2008, the Zimbabwean government went through a similar hyperinflation crisis. at the time this note was printed, for example, the largest note they had, $100 billion, it had the buying power of 3 eggs. So that's, again, it seems kind of silly to think how useless this paper money was, but think the disaster it would be to live in this kind of economy. There's a lot of political instability in this Weimar Republic. You had sort of two political extremes. On the far left, you had communists and socialists, and they didn't like the government. So there was an uprising in the 1920s called the Spartacist Uprising. These left-wing workers who identified themselves as Spartacus, the slave revolutionary in ancient Rome, led this huge general strike across Germany. On the other side, you had the Freikorps. These were made mostly of veterans from World War One, and as the war ended, and they didn't trust the government, and they find that their friends and family are dead or moved on. A lot of them don't have much of a social network to rely on. So instead, they sort of regrouped as military officers. Not official military officers, that's the paramilitary part, but they acted like military officers. And they saw the Spartacists, these left-wing communist socialists, as trying to overthrow the government, and maybe the ones that led the Weimar Republic. So as the strike goes on, the Freikorps put up their own attempt to fight the Spartacists, literally fighting. You can see sending up this Maxim machine gun in the streets in Berlin. So you have this instability, almost a civil war in Germany. The Freikorps later, in the Kapp-Putsch, would try to overthrow the government. So there's lots of political instability. The United States in particular saw this as a problem. They wanted to make sure that Germany would be stable after the war. So they created what's called the Dawes Plan. The plan basically was for the United States to loan money to Germany to build up its industry, and they would use that money in their industry to pay back their debt to the European powers from the Treaty of Versailles, which the European powers, like Britain and France, would then use to pay back the Americans, which had loaned them much money during World War One, and make this nice cycle of productivity. There also is an attempt to stabilize this. There was a bunch of peace treaties and declarations signed in the 19-teens and 20s, 20s and 30s. Probably most significant was the Locarno Pact, or Locarno Treaty, which basically all its signatories said, we're never going to use war as a political solution again. Basically that no more war, which sounds really optimistic, but coming out of World War One, you can see why there's maybe a desire for that kind of optimism. Again, there's the Dawes Plan. The U.S. would lend money to Germany, and then Germany would use those tax revenues to pay back the Allies from the Treaty of Versailles, and the Allies would pay back the Americans from their debts in World War One. So as we move out of the teens and into the 20s and into the early 30s, mostly the 20s, let's say, things were looking pretty good in the United States. It seemed like Europe was recovering. We're going to see another disaster, though, economically, that's beyond Germany and becomes lays the foundation for the disasters of World War II.